I hope you all have enjoyed your tea. We are now about to start our final session of the international conference. This session is also on climate and environment, and this session will be chaired by Dr. Waqar Waghu. Dr. Waqar Waghu is the Director of Graduate Studies, Senior Research Fellow, and Associate Professor at Lahore School of Economics. Over to you, Dr. Waghu.
Thank you. So, two things about this. Number one, this is just between you and lunch is to try to do it as early as possible. We have two very young researchers with us, presentations, and it's on the same topic, which really is important for most of the developing countries. Also in Pakistan, is experiencing flooding and stream events quite frequently. So, without wasting any time, I'll invite the first speaker.
I'll start firstly with a few acknowledgements. Firstly, of course, to this conference for assembling all of us here and for all of the interesting papers we've had so far over the last couple of days. Second, I will acknowledge the Institute of International Education, which is the agency that has funded this research. Technically, it's not a research grant, it's an implementation and development grant through the Centennial Fellowship Program. So I'm thankful for them, which made all of this work possible. School Education and Literacy Department, Government of Sindh, for giving us access to not just data and resources in terms of access to their officials, but also access to the public schools that we are working with. And then our implementation partners, Habib University and the EU School Center. Since this is a one-year fellowship, we've also been thinking about what happens once that fellowship ends. And in order to continue with this project and a few different things that we've put up in this process, we're in the process of registering a new, not exactly an NGO, sort of like a non-profit or Hyphen Resource Center. The other thing quite important here is to note that this is an ongoing project. So what I will share with you are very, very good preliminary analyses. The data that we collected was as late as the end of July, so it's very, very recent. So I'm going to put that out there up front. The other thing I will add is, obviously we care about whether or not this model works, which is why we're doing this research. But at the same time, we're also very interested in how it does work, or why it does work, or why it doesn't. So at the risk of being blasphemous within this audience, we are relying more heavily on qualitative measures. Even though this is overall an RCT, our primary methodology is qualitative, where we use a lot of observations, interviews, and focus groups. So with that, this is essentially the context we're working in. I won't go into too much detail since we've talked about all of this for the last couple of days. But essentially, Pakistan is one of the countries which is most adversely impacted because of climate change, even though its actual contribution to carbon emissions is very, very minimal when compared to the other developed countries. When we talk about climate change, we also talk about the impact on different sectors, different audiences, different communities. We talk about its disproportionate impact on various communities, and especially when it comes to the education sector, we talk about how it impacts schools, how it disrupts learning, and how it impacts children and all of their outcomes. What we don't spend a lot of time talking about is what can the schools do and what can the children do in this fight against climate change. So that's kind of where our project comes in, and that's kind of the starting point of our conversation here. So our goal is to raise awareness about climate change. That's primarily where the funding is coming for. The other thing that we want to do, like mentioned earlier, is to talk about what kids can do. So we're not claiming that kids can solve climate change, right? That's not the goal. Our goal is for them to have more awareness about what's happening, and I that in a very scientific or terminology about what climate change is, but rather to better understand their own lived experiences, right? If you live in Karachi, you have urban heat, you have various other things, you go through floods, but do you really connect all of that with climate change, and how do you make those connections is kind of what we want to work with. The other thing we want to do is to offer them a way for these conversations to become public discourse and to engage the communities who are actually being impacted by all of this. And then we talk about taking an action-oriented approach, so not just talking about things, but also thinking about what can we do in terms of mitigation and adaptation within our local context. The other thing we want to see is how can we leverage public schools. There's a lot of research out there that talks about all of the various ways the school buildings can be used, the school infrastructure can be used. So that's kind of what we also want to build on with this. And at the end, of course, when you have these sort of student-centric activities, student and teacher development is a very inherent component in all of those sort of things. So the intervention that we are essentially running is that we're establishing civic clubs in public schools. Even though the focus of our intervention right now is raising awareness about climate change, we don't want to limit it to just climate change. We're already building this infrastructure, so instead of focusing only on climate, we're making it more broadly civic-oriented. So the students in the schools can use the same infrastructure to talk about a number of other issues, whatever their interests may be. The basic idea or the concept behind all of this is once you create that infrastructure, you are essentially giving students the opportunity to engage, right? They can engage in conversations, in action, in all of those sorts of things, which would lead to them learning more about these things. They would conduct research, not necessarily academic research, but they would still learn more about what's going on around them. They'll talk to their parents, they'll talk to the local communities, and they'll start building those networks. When you also engage the schools, the other thing that happens is that you're not just talking to local communities, but then you also start talking to local institutions. Schools start communicating with each other, and that's also part of what we're doing with this model. So there also is the competition of the element of competition within that. So if one school is doing something, they're showcasing that work, so the other schools also feel motivated and inspired to do additional things, and then that network continues to build first at the district level and then at the provincial level, which will also lead to a lot of partnerships. When we talk about education, there is a lot of different NGOs that are working with the schools, so this also provides them an opportunity to engage. And of course, it leads to a lot of student and teacher development, and then it provides them exposure and opportunity for additional civic engagement even outside of climate-related events. So we did some exploratory pre-pilot over the spring of this year. We worked with 5 schools from across Karachi, which were randomly selected. What we did was we went to the schools, we first conducted our baseline surveys, we established civic clubs, and then we give the student leaders an onboarding session which talks about this is what the purpose of the club is, this is what climate change is, it gives them some brief awareness, subject knowledge sort of things, and then we talk to them about what you can do going forward. In a subsequent visit, we go there and we conduct a vegetable gardening activity, and through that activity, we talk to them about concepts like green cover, carbon emissions, carbon sinks, and those sorts of things. So primarily the method for this evaluation is one group pre-test, post-test design. We use pre-test and post-test surveys, which are measuring 2 basic things. One, knowledge about the subject matter, and then there's attitudes and participation in civic activities. As I mentioned before, we also do a lot of observations and semi-structured interviews. The other thing we did over the summer is we did this summer camp for 4 different schools. A total of 40 students participated in that summer camp. And one of the primary goals for this was to see what the actual baseline for the student body is, learn more about what they already know, what kind of activities are tracking more traction, what do they like, what do they want to do essentially. So we had some knowledge sessions, we had some experiential activities, and then we had some gamification models where we were teaching them through games. Again, same method, pre-post test, observations, and focus groups and interviews. So what we find so far is when it comes to the test civic clubs that we ran in the spring, there was no statistical significance in either of the variables, either on knowledge or on their civic participation, which isn't surprising because that pilot ran for only a couple of weeks, so it doesn't give them enough time to really learn anything or for their participation to change. But when you talk about the summer camp, we did find positive results, and I think that was primarily because it was more experiential, it was more substantive, because we weren't going to the school for an hour or 2 hours. This was a 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., 5 days a week, deeper engagement, where all of these students engage with each other. So we find that the knowledge level goes up by about 18.8% compared to the mean, and even though we don't find statistically significant impact on civic participation, which again isn't surprising because they're here with us, it's not going to change immediately. But what's interesting is we find a 1.6% difference between female students showing more positive attitudes and participation rates for civic engagement. Based on these two, the major issues that we've identified so far, firstly is that the students and the schools became too reliant on our project team, right? So when we go for the activities, the entire conversation after the event is, okay, when are you coming next? What are we going to do the next time you visit? Instead of talking about, okay, this is the one thing we did with you, and this is how we want to take the club forward. The other thing, when we talk about school interest, we also find low interest levels from some schools, depending on what their understanding of the club is. A lot of them had concerns about how this could potentially take away from their curriculum. They couldn't find those connections that even when we're talking about climate change or social issues, it's not completely removed from curriculum. It's not something that you do in addition to it. It's something you can inculcate within your classroom as well. You have social studies, science, in various subjects where you can engage all of this. Another major issue was obviously the short time duration, both in terms of the total intervention period for the spring, as well as the time we spent with the schools themselves. The other thing, obviously, there was no cross-school interaction, right? Because we were going to the schools, so we were only talking to the students who were already there. One of the things we wanted to do was for this to become a community engagement, right? So how do you bring about that connection where students are only engaging with themselves? And obviously there was no significant impact, but like I said, that wasn't like a major issue for us right now. So in our updated plan, what we've done is we are running the full pilot over the entire academic year, starting from August all the way through May of next year. We've selected 3 to 5 schools from each district. There are a total of 7 districts in Karachi, which roughly gives us a treatment size of 30 schools, 30 for control. Broadly, it's going to be a RCP design, and then we've added 2 key things here. The first thing we do, even before we go to the schools to establish the clubs, we invite the school heads and the club advisor to Habib University, where they engage in a 2-day capacity building workshop. There's 2 different things that we want to do here. Firstly, we want to talk to them about the project, to get them on board. And second, we wanted their feedback on how they think the clubs would function, because we were coming from an approach of what we thought the clubs would look like, but without working in the schools, it's very different. So we wanted to get their feedback as well. We also gave them some awareness sessions, knowledge sessions, a lot of mechanics and logistics, talked about things like how do you do something when you don't have resources, because we're not giving them the budget to run any of these activities, because that's not going to be sustainable. So we talk to them about how they can engage all of this within their classrooms, how they can partner with community organizations, how they can partner with schools. We spend a lot of time talking to them about peer networks. We have WhatsApp groups for districts, for the treatment group, and we have a lot of communication going on over that. So that training was held earlier this month. Now we are working on our baseline surveys, and then once we do the baseline, we will again have a 2-day workshop where we invite the 3 leaders, student leaders for the clubs, as well as the club advisor. Again, we want to talk to them about all of this, but the other thing we want to emphasize here is to see, give them the simulations of how they could plan activities and execute activities. One key thing we're worried about here is two different things happening. First, either the school doesn't take as much interest and nothing really happens in the schools, or two, the school takes a lot of interest and they end up hijacking the club, and instead of the students, it's the staff that's running the club. So these are the things we're trying to focus on. So even in the training earlier and the subsequent training, we want to focus on the role of the teachers as facilitators and not as the leaders of the club. I briefly spoke about all of this. So in terms of our data collection, we're doing pre-test surveys and then post-test inline surveys. Again, a lot of observations and semi-structured interviews and focus groups. So that's kind of our plan going forward. We also have a few side quests that we're interested in the sense of we're establishing these civic clubs, and after this pilot, if things work well, the next stage is to establish these in 300 model schools that the Road Crescent has identified. So we also want to see how we can engage the communities, how we can use these as starting points to engage with the community. We want to see if we can develop sort of a network where all of the schools and the other organizations who work in the sector can develop shared resources and benefit from each other. But the other thing we want to see is we're working with grade 8 students who will be registered voters in the next couple of years. So we want to see how this civic engagement sort of intervention can help prepare them for that thing and how that would sort of go on. I'm out of time and I don't really have a lot of new things to add. Anyways, these are side quests and not completely critical, but these are some of the things we're thinking about as we develop the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. We have a discussion. Mani, please.
Thank you so much. After I had a great time reading this. Just a brief summary of what you explained really well. So your main research question is basically your key objective is to test the efficacy of these civic clubs in managing the students and basically creating an awareness on how you can basically increase this engagement alongside increasing their knowledge levels to become better citizens. The methodology that you're pointing out is that you're going to get data from two interventions. The first one is basically establishing these civic clubs under a vegetable garden, and the second one is where you're inviting them to a big university for a 5-day summer camp. The results, as you mentioned, because of the short time duration, do not come out as significant for either of the two variables that you are mentioning. So what I really like about this paper is its extreme relevance to Pakistan, given that Pakistan does not contribute more than 1% to the overall carbon emissions, and still it's facing detrimental effects of the climate change. I think it's very relevant that you bring this topic up and are working on it. And the second thing that I feel is very relevant is the target sample that you have, like the grade 8 students that you are targeting, because these students are basically, you're providing them with an opportunity so that they are able to understand their basic rights and their responsibilities as citizens. And if you're giving them this information, they can pass this on and it can be like a ripple effect to their families and their neighbors. And then you can see a larger effect like in Karachi. So I think you clarified some of these points in your presentation, which I was unable to understand through the paper. So the first one was that, like, is there any particular reason for choosing a kitchen garden to measure this awareness? And you can also do like a tree plantation drive or a, cleaning drive. Like, is there any specific reason for why you choose that? The second one, I think you clarified that now you're going to go to 7 districts, but I was unsure, like, is there a difference between the schools in the northern areas and like northern or southern part of things? So is there a difference in that aspect? Additionally, like, how exactly are you measuring the engagement score and the knowledge levels? Like, what are the variables? Like how do you measure it? And I'm also curious about how this measurement will be in the long run, because it's very difficult to measure an immediate effect of your intervention, right? So how do you intend to measure the long run effects? And some additional thoughts basically are like, do you check for heterogeneity, or do you intend to along these dimensions, like how can the effect differ in terms of the socioeconomic status, by the area they belong to, whether they are in the rural or urban areas, by existing mass media exposure, like they already have exposure, are they more aware of their contribution to the environment? And lastly, what is the family background? Like, what is the family's general awareness or knowledge about being a responsible citizen? And moving on to further research, I think one of these points you also mentioned, that going forward, I mean, partnerships with local government organizations or local environments may actually just make your intervention a lot stronger. So I think that would be a good idea. And in case you intend to scale out, I hope you do, it would be interesting if you can compare the results between public and private schools to see if there is any difference. I also think that you mentioned that you want to include the teachers going forward. So I mentioned that going forward, if you have like a head teacher engagement, which could act like a role model, like if you're informing the teacher how to act, they can pass that on to their students, and maybe because they look at teachers as a role model, students are more likely to listen to them. So I think that would be interesting if we can have. But overall, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for your time. We open up for questions. Maybe, and then one.
Yeah, this seems like an exciting project. A couple of things. So one has already mentioned something about cleanup drives and tree plantation, but I was also thinking about just how bad the air quality is, so air purifiers and filter masks. Those are like kind of things that you can also measure if they're taken up, like, at the school level. But then also thinking about whether they're going home and passing on this information. So you might want to measure from the students directly if they talk to any friends outside the school, if they talk to their siblings or their parents, and there you could see more immediate effects instead of waiting for them to vote for another 4 or 5 years, whether their siblings are more likely to vote or their parents, but also then are they taking up some of those activities at home if you want really for this to be a community wide effect.
Really exciting work. So I was wondering so you showed that there's not a lot of community engagement right now, which is, you said it's early, but I was wondering if the activities that you discussed with them are explicitly something communal. So if you imagine air pollution, not many people will think this is something that I can tackle on my own, but yes, I do need the community to help, perhaps we do something together, but not sure if students can do that or think about that much, right, or take action on it. And then following from that, for your RCT at least, you may want to think about having some events at the community level, and then taking into what Maureen was also saying. If you have those events, then you can very nicely also measure that having students who live in a particular community who engage in those events, does that also lead to increased knowledge at the community level with other friends, and so does the engagement generally increase if you kind of nudge them or help them a bit more? Thank you.
So, what I like about the study is that you're working with the generation that inherit this climate crisis. So, just a suggestion that it would be very interesting to see pre and post intervention. What are the perspective and knowledge of the students? Is it improving? Because if it is, then eventually they might make some decisions in their career to enter this climate crisis.
I think you have one question. Then you have to perform a test for a combination test and for validity and reliability test. I think you didn't mention that. If you don't have any question, then there is no easy thing. Thank you.
Okay, so I think these are the questions. Maybe I had one with respect to lunch breaks, because I didn't find it. You read already in inquiries. When you are saying there are some reasons, you really test for them that this might be a possible explanation for why you are having business. Because one thing was coming in my mind that you are working with teenagers, and asking about really basic information, so there might already be a situation there because the control group might have very high needs. So, just really big intervention to change from there.
Thank you for all of the questions and comments. Starting from why we do vision gardening. So part of the reason was because we wanted to talk to them about carbon emissions, carbon sinks, and all those sorts of things, but we didn't want it to be like a seminar where we just give them that information. We wanted it to be experiential. And that's partly my other bias coming in because I'm also researching on experiential learning as a pedagogy. So that's sort of interface here. But the other reason was also because we wanted it to be something that they can take home, right? So if you do a cleanup drive or a tree plantation somewhere, it ends at the site. We wanted them to do plantations in small pots and then take those home. They could then use that as a starting point for conversation with their siblings, with their parents, with the communities. And there was also the added benefit of if you take care of it, you get fruit or vegetable building out of it, right? So it's not just for the environment, there's also a very concrete, tangible output that you can get out of it. In terms of variation in SIN, so we haven't tested for that as of now. We only had 5 schools, so it didn't make sense for us to do a lot of that right now. But yes, that's something we do plan on doing when we run the full pilot, which is why we've also selected these schools across all of these districts, so we can also compare across district effects. We do expect there to be some variations. For example, districts like Kimari, where you are at the coast, that's a very different population, that's a very different impact of climate change versus somebody in District Central. So those kind of things we are already thinking about, and we do plan on checking that. The question was about what sort of variables we have within these two. So for knowledge, those are essentially knowledge questions, right? So do you know about this? So a lot of the questions are about SDGs. They're about basic concepts like what's good for plant growth. The questions on I don't remember what the questions, but essentially these are knowledge-based questions on whether or not you know about climate change and all of these things. For civic participation, we have 2 different things. We measure their attitudes, so how important do you think it is to vote? And we also talk to them about their participation. So in the past 3 months, have you done X, Y, Z? Have you participated in any volunteer activities? Have you participated in any other kinds of activities? So we are asking them what they've done in the past 3 months. And then we compute both of them to give them a civic engagement score based on their attitudes and their participations. In terms of the longer term effects, that's partly why I was thinking about that nonprofit that I talked to you about, because at the end of the fellowship, the project doesn't end, right? So even the core of the intervention, it's not going to have immediate effect. So we want to keep that work going. And one of the easiest ways we could think of was to sort of incorporate an organization that does this kind of work. We have a lot of interest in that, so we're still figuring out exactly how to do that, how to fund all of that, but that's something we're already thinking about, yes. In terms of partnerships, right now we do have implementation partners, but they're more in the sense of logistical support and not really implementation support, because one of the things that happens, at least in SIN, is we do a lot of interventions, we do a lot of these implementations, but we don't think about it in a systematic research way, right? So for example, a similar project is being done through a Malala Fund project, STEAM Pakistan, some of you might be familiar with it. Essentially what they're doing is they're setting up STEAM clubs to promote education in STEM plus arts. It's a good project, but they haven't got any baseline data collection, they're not looking into a research point of view. Their goal is just to go and implement. And we want to do that implementation, but also we want to do that systematic research, which is kind of a barrier when we talk about other partnerships. The other thing with public and private schools, so the reason we're working with public schools is primarily because of 2 main reasons. Firstly, the scale of the impact. There are a lot more public schools, most of our population goes to public schools, and those are the communities that need more of that awareness, because in private schools generally you have more access and exposure to these kinds of things. So that's partly the scale of the impact. And the other thing is the infrastructure of public schools. Overall, largely speaking, public schools have lower resources and low capacity of school administration and all of those other challenges. So if we can come up with a model that works for public schools, it's going to be easily transferable and adaptable for private schools because they have higher resource. But yeah, that's something we are thinking about in the near future, that once we solidify this model, how do we go forward? The other thing we're doing, we're developing a lot of material. We have manuals for civic clubs, we have activity guides, we have storybooks in the pipeline that talk about climate change. Within these local contexts, so we have a story coming from Gorky, we have a story from the urban slum in Karachi, so that these kids are reading about these things and they see representation and they're able to better relate. And all of this material we are going to be making available publicly, so any school, any organization that wants to do this, they will have all of their toolkit and they can just start implementation, because it's not very high resource that we need to sort of start implementing any of these. The other question about so one of the things we do ask in the survey is, have you ever talked about these issues with your siblings, with your friends? So we do have data on that, and we do hope that they continue these conversations, which is again goes back to why we're doing virtual gardens, so they can have that starting point and like a physical object that raises these questions, and it becomes like an organic discussion. In terms of doing activities, we right now haven't been very prescriptive, because we also don't want to be very involved in what these clubs do, because we're also thinking about sustainability, right? Like we're here for a year with this fellowship funds, but what happens after that, right? So it's a tricky balance in the sense that we're trying to give these clubs all of the resources that we think they need, but at the same time giving them as few resources as we can for it to be sustainable in the longer term. So what we do in terms of resources is we're giving them literally resource bank, and I've said resource like 15 times now. What essentially that means is that we're giving them a folder which contains a lot of research on what activities can be done, what material they need, we're giving them guides and those sorts of things. So essentially anything that we can develop in this year and that can be used in perpetuity, that's the kind of resource we're trying to develop right now. Sure. I think in terms of community-based activities, again, we do, so we're not directly telling them to do community events. What we're telling them to do is think about peer support and peer networks. And our hope is that once they start collaborating across schools and across districts, they organically do community events. We do talk to them about stakeholders. So one of the sessions we did with the teachers was to talk about the impact at the student level, at the teacher level, at the school level, at the community level. And we talk to them about stakeholders as parents and organizations. So we're giving them those primers, but at the same time, we also don't want to be very, very descriptive. I think I got most of them. If there's any other questions, maybe we chat later as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to our second presentation by Aska from Law School.
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Aska, and the paper that I'm presenting today is the Beyond Borders comparative analysis of trading partners and regional trade integration on CO2 emissions in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So this paper is a collaborative effort of Dr. Rabia Ikram, Ayman Nadeem, and Hamza Ali Baksh. The aim of this paper, or the research focus of this paper, is actually to understand that how regional integration and the type of or the choice of trading partners has an effect on CO2 emission, particularly focusing on the varying effect, the varying effect across countries, that is Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Whether the effect on CO2 emission is varying across these countries, that is, are they showing uneven effects across these South Asian countries or not? This is the point of concern that we will be focusing on, right? So is climate change. And we are here to understand that what role trade can play in order to reduce this, the challenge of climate change. And because we know that one of the SDG goals is to achieve a net zero emission by 2050 with a target of 45% reduction by 2030. So sustainability experts have also identified it as a crisis, and they are very much emphasizing on the fact that it's very important to actually integrate the climate action with other economic activities so that a good collaborative effort with different sectors of the economy can bring positive results in terms of reducing the CO2 emissions, right? Because we have seen that trade does play a role in determining CO2 emissions. It could be a positive role or a negative role, right? So this is the understanding that we have from the papers that have come up earlier. But what the papers suggest, the results have been ambiguous. Whether trade is causing a positive effect or a negative effect on the environment, this is something that we want to actually focus on, and whether these effects are uneven or not across countries. So, although earlier papers have discussed this topic, what are we actually doing in this paper is actually focusing on whether the effect of trade is having any effect on CO2 emission from the regional and global perspective. Because studies have found that increased regional integration does help in bringing down CO2 emissions, because one of the studies conducted on the South Asian countries did find that increased regional trade integration did reduce the overall CO2 emissions. And what they were focusing on is that the type of products that have been traded in, amongst these countries tend to be more environmentally friendly, and also what there has been an exchange of or transfer of what you can say green technology, or the technology that helps in reducing these emissions. Another study that was conducted on the African Western African states also found that regional trade tends to be less detrimental compared to the global trade. So here again they found that because of the type of products that have been traded amongst these countries, such kind of results were actually coming forward. So again, if we look at the global perspective, what are we finding? That if developing countries are trading with the developed world, the effect that we see in terms of environment is negative. And one of the models that helps us understand this linkage is the North-South trade model. What this particular model suggests is that if developing country is trading with the developed world, there are chances of increasing CO2 emissions in the developing countries. Reason being that it might result in the reallocation of what you can say dirty industries in the developing countries, and also in order to attract foreign investment, these developing countries might be reducing their or making it easy for the foreign investor to come in, and they might ease their environmental regulations. So this helps us understand that this could be a reason why trading with the developed world can have a detrimental effects on the developing country. Because if we try to understand the South-South model, that is the trade happening between the developing world, we find the model suggests that it does have a positive implication on the host country if they are involved in trading in the type of products that is actually environmentally friendly or cleaner. That is, the processes involved are much more cleaner than the other products. So based on these trade dynamics, what we are actually focusing on, the research question that we will be focusing on is, does regional integration have any effect or matters for CO2 emissions? Moreover, the second research question is focusing on, does trading with highly or high polluting countries have a different effect compared to trading with low polluting countries? And does this effect vary across countries, the three countries that are under focus? The third research question that we will be actually focusing on is, what is right? And finally, what the final research question, or the fourth research question, is actually focusing on, it does the effect of how does the emissions are affected for a particular country if they are trading with different regions. For example, if they're trading with EU, if they're trading with US, or if they're trading with what you can say African countries. How the emissions differ if a country is trading with different basically different regions. So in order to answer these research questions, we will be basically using the following models. The first model will be used to answer our first research question, where the main dependent variable is actually the CO2 emission per capita, and the dependent variable and the main independent variable is the regional integration. So the other controls that we are using are there in the model. The second research question will be, in order to answer the second research question, the second model highlights that what impact what is the impact on emissions if a country is trading with the top polluters versus the bottom polluting countries, right? The third question is being answered by, will be focused on the model that it also incorporates trade with China. We will further disintegrate this trade into imports and exports with China to understand whether export to China is having an effect on CO2 emission, or imports from China is having an effect. So finally, the fourth research question will be answered using our fourth model, that how the CO2 emissions are affected by trading with different regions. So in order to ensure robustness of our results, we are basically using what we are counting for cross-sectional dependency. We are also checking for stationarity and applying co-integration tests as well. And finally, in order to estimate our results, what we are using a fully modified OLS to come up with our actual results. So what are the main results are showing? What are the main results showing? Let's try to understand. Our first, or the baseline regression results, is actually showing that regional integration does have a positive effect overall for all three countries. But if we try to find out the country-specific effects, we see that only Pakistan, in terms of Pakistan is positively affected by the regional trade integration. So this helps us, and again, this what you can say, this result is very much in line with what one of the papers by Murshid et al. Had also put forward earlier as well. However, we can see that the other two countries, Bangladesh and India, their results are not significant. So if we, from this, we try to understand that again, regional trade does not have similar effect on all these three countries. It is having varying effects across these three countries. So if we look at the other control variables in the model, they suggest that the renewable energy is having, or the renewable energy consumption is having a positive effect on CO2 emissions, and again, institutional quality is having a positive effect, or you could say that it is helping in reducing CO2 emission, and so is the consumption of renewable energy. Economic growth, the variable that we are using is GDP. So initially, what the GDP variable is showing that it a positive effect on CO2 emission, but if we use GDP squared, it is the results are coming out to be negative and significant, which helps us understand that the relationship is an inverted U, and it's following the environmental equation, and by incorporating the exports to top polluters and the imports from the top polluters. And the idea that or the results that we see here are that the exports to top polluter is having a negative effect. So the exports to the top polluter is having a negative effect. Why is that? Is something that we will be focusing on. That is it because of the product mix, or is it because of the sectors that are under focus? Again, the imports from the top polluters. What we see is if we are having if we are importing from the top polluters, all three countries are showing that it will cause an increase in CO2 emissions. But if we are exporting to the top polluters, it is negatively affecting CO2 emissions. That means what we are exporting is not carbon intensive products, right? The third question is basically focusing on how trade with China has an effect. So to briefly or summarize this table, we can see that trading with China has a positive effect on Pakistan in terms of environmental impact. That is, trade with China is helping Pakistan reduce its CO2 emissions. And if it is same for if we look at the overall impact of trade with China on Pakistan's CO2 emission, and furthermore, if we disintegrate the results in terms of export to China and import from China, they are showing similar results. However, the results are not the same, or they are showing uneven effects of this trade on CO2 emissions for the other two countries, and we can see that export to China is having a positive effect on CO2 emissions. That is, it is causing CO2 emissions to increase in Bangladesh and India. So that would suggest that what the type of export or the exporting products in Bangladesh and India going to China are more involve carbon intensive processes. And again, if we look for the imports from China, we can see that it is having an effect, a negative effect on all the three countries. That means that this suggests that the imports coming from China to these three countries are less carbon intensive. Again, this is something that we plan to look at in our future research, because this is a work in progress, and we really want to understand where are these emissions coming from. If these emissions are increasing, where are these emissions coming from? Are they coming from the sector? Are they sector specific, product specific? So we will be actually bringing our research to the firm level as well in future. Finally, if we look at the fourth research question, we see that do the effects of trade with different regions have different effects on CO2 emissions? And what we find is that in Pakistan, for example, so if we look at from the results from the top polluter, you can say the trade with EU and trade with Middle East, the results are consistent for the three countries. So trade with EU is showing that it is having a negative effect, or it is causing CO2 emissions to increase. So this again brings forward the discussion that whether it is because of the North-South trade model suggestions that were initially discussed, that whether trading with the developer world is having a negative impact in terms of environment by causing CO2 emissions to increase. However, for other regions such as the US and the African countries, we do find uneven effect of trade. That is, they are not similar across these three countries. So this brings us to the final. So this brings us to our final slide, that is focusing on the policy implications. Every country needs to focus on their policy based on their country specific characteristics, and should not focus on just one particular policy, because the characteristics
It was very interesting and there was a lot to unpack within the paper as I read it. At the outset, the paper sets up quite a few hypotheses. It talks about how regional trade would reduce emissions, how local trade would make a country a net exporter of emissions, and conversely how local trade would make a country a net importer. There's also discussions of CO2 emissions in general and the trade-embedded CO2 emissions. There's also particular interest in trade with China. There's regions, West Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and how that impacts the emission status across multiple countries. And so, going through the paper, it was really interesting because you touched upon a lot of areas on trade and climate change, especially in the context of South Asia, and with 3 of the biggest countries in the region. And some of the themes, such as regional integration, this concept of embedded emissions, intra-regional and inter-regional trade, are also very important from a policy perspective. And I can see the policy relevance for a lot of these themes, especially as Pakistan goes into it. Maybe it's arguments on its national return contributions, some quantification on its GHG emissions, and figures out ways to have GHG reduction in the future. So there is elements that this paper could support for policy reforms. And I think some of this data, if it is zoned in and honed in a specific way, can actually be useful for Ministry of Climate Change, say for example, or even the Planning Commission as they revise NDC's report on the 2030 agenda. What I did enjoy was how you leveraged a lot of the international data sets that were available to kind of quantify the elements that you wanted to look at as variables within your research. My biggest feedback for the paper would be I think you're trying to do too much within one document, and you could really benefit from making it as a series of papers probably, with much more focused insights on particular themes. So you can try and regroup on what you hope a particular paper has to achieve, and then really honing on an area of interest. So, I mean, just as an example, do you want Pakistan on a low emitter pathway? Is that like a takeaway from this? What should Pakistan be doing for that? Or is it something about how international trade is practiced and how we need to rethink how we define emissions, etc. So I think my takeaway as I read it the first time around was that I didn't understand what I was supposed to get as a policy maker in terms of results. And so my view for academics in the room, and it would be interesting to see the feedback that they have. So for example, for us, and even when we go to government officials and presenting a paper or some kind of research, their biggest question would be, like, why do you think this is happening, and why is that relevant for us, right? So that question of why and what that means would be very crucial. And I think thinking through some of that will help you also, benchmark and understand how you want to cut through some of the research and reorganize it in some ways. In terms of more specific areas, there was the first one to kind of discuss was regional integration, but we don't really understand within the paper itself. Maybe that's something that you can expand on what that means. You're using an index that is divided by 8 week, but we don't really have a sense of what that index is, what it's trying to measure, and also how you're trying to define the region. Because depending on again what the scope of the paper is and what it's trying to achieve, a region can be many different things. So even within the World Bank itself, for example, if I tell you, so for International Bank of Reconstruction and Development would classify Pakistan as a South Asian country, but in the private sector arm, Pakistan is considered a mega country just because of how the policies work and how the scope of particular regional integration is in the A similar question in terms of what constitutes institutional quality is also something that I could not understand from the paper itself, and it might really be useful to understand that, especially when you see the impact that institutional quality could have on trade, on environment, on some use of technology, etc. So what are the lessons that we learned there, and how we choose to interpret that post results would really depend on how we understand institutional quality itself. So it would be useful to actually have some background on that as well. There's a lot of factors within the paper that you mentioned that do impact emissions, and there's a lot of broader just thinking through factors that we know impact emissions, right? What level of development the country is at, if it's what kind of exports it undertakes, if it uses clean energy or not, what the technological imbalances are. Those are some of the things that you have discussed, and some of the other. But there's also outcomes in different emissions, but again, what does that really mean for the research that you're trying to do? I would also think that maybe, depending on how you choose to frame it, some standardization might be helpful. Like these are the kind of goods that are being exported, this is the level of institutional maturity that we're looking at, etc. So those could be some of the elements that you could benchmark, and maybe that would be a more standardized way to approach the paper. So I don't think like the main impact for me would come from if it's like, oh, X, Y, and Z impacts emissions, but so what, right? And this is, and you mentioned that that's something that you want to do in policy, and from the policy perspective, I think that would be probably the most relevant outcome from some of these things. The introduction to China was also very interesting to me because China also created multiple categories within the different variables that we're trying to assess, because it would be, if you want to think about it as a regional partner, it's also one of the high-polluting countries. So if there's a reason why China was separated, it would be nice to mention that within the paper itself. Alternatively, China could also be a case study that combines kind of these two elements, and you can flesh that out a little further. Some smaller comments, you talked about in the beginning to really start off with discussing like these overall GHG emissions and trade and energy GHG emissions, and you provide the breakdown for those. But as you go through the paper, somehow that narrative kind of gets lost. And maybe there's a reason you want to focus on trade and energy or like overall GHG emissions, but it would be nice to know why one is being excluded, or if you want to include both, then maybe we run through the entire thing. There's also a lot of heterogeneous results within the document, and I think that is also why it would be really interesting to explore what are these elements that result in these kind of changes that we're seeing. And depending on what the results come out to be, and depending on how you decide to focus your paper, you could make statements about a lot of different things, right? We have these traded energy emissions, for example. Are you analyzing that because you want to develop some policy results for Pakistan? Do you want to make a comment on some of the trade linkages that are occurring in the areas that we should focus on? Is it about the broader global policies like NDC commitments or the agenda? Or is it something that maybe global policymakers should be considering when they talk about GHG emissions, right? This was something that especially Chinese researchers at one point, leading up to COP21, when the Paris Agreement was signed, were really trying to say that, okay, China is a net, a very high emitter of GHG emissions, but if you look in terms of trade, actually a lot of these emissions get exported. So maybe there's some kind of policy angle there as well. So that's on the comments from my side. It was overall very nice to read, and I look forward to further updates.
So we open up, and I mean, just so this we could just set 3 questions maybe. Please.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. So in your regression specification, I think it's important to control for some other measures of industrial policy. For example, the level of investment or FDI. Because if you're looking at countries like China or Bangladesh, there's just so much construction going on, which is an important determinant of carbon emissions, but may not be directly related to export or trade-related activities. So I noticed that in your list of controls, maybe you should include FDI, for example, and also if you could think of because there is the effect of other possible confounders. So if you could, I know it's hard, but if you could think of possible IV strategies that you could use to make it more robust.
Thank you everyone for all the comments, especially Rehan. So what she actually put forward are all very relevant questions, and this is something that we are actually planning to focus on in our further research, but I really appreciate you suggesting us to break down our overall research into different papers, and I agree on that. One of the questions that you highlighted is that what are we measuring when we are saying that the regional integration? So what are we actually, what is the variable actually? It's the trade with the South Asian countries becomes more policy focused. And because I was short on time, I was unable to discuss the policy implications. But again, as Nehan discussed, that I need to focus, and all of us, we need to focus on our policy relevance of these particular the findings that we have come with. As for the suggestions made by Zara and Nida, they make perfect sense, because again, we can look into adding FDIs and other variables as control, so that we can actually try and find out what we control for such variable, and we are able to find more good results. As for Nida's suggestion, we will definitely see in terms of what you were saying, emissions per capita that you were mentioning. This is something that we will look into, and that will definitely help us in polishing our results as well, and come up with something that is useful for overall policy recommendations, and our overall findings will become better as a result. I thank you all for making such good suggestions that we can incorporate in our paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you all presenters and discussants. You made my job pretty easy. And we are all set for lunch, I think. So let's give them a hand.